Hello everyone, and welcome to this new talk. We are going back to prehistory tonight to examine a cultural and anthropological concept called behavioral modernity. What is it? Scholars agree that our species, Homo sapiens, became extraordinarily successful in its colonization of Earth and its technical and cultural development, way more successful than previous species of archaic humans. Because tens of thousands of years ago, we developed or acquired or began to express a series of cognitive traits and behaviors. Traits like a capacity for abstract thinking, artistic expression through visual arts, ornamentation, music, dance, an advanced capacity for planning, the development of technical abilities such as much better tools, much better blades. This list of traits is called behavioral modernity. And in order to try to understand prehistoric humans, we are going to explore it. How did it appear? Why? Where? Is this list of traits really pertinent? Because we will see that the concept of behavioral modernity is well accepted among experts as a general idea, but it becomes way more complicated and debated when it comes to defining it and studying it based on archaeological records. So this little exploration journey will make us travel around the world and at different periods. We will talk about the life of prehistoric men, their art, their societies, their way of looking at the world, and what distinguished Homo sapiens from archaic humans. There's a lot to discover. For now, make yourself comfortable. Let the tension go in your shoulders. Also, if you wish to support this channel or get more of it, like downloads, all the tracks with background sounds, no ads obviously, surveys, early releases, and announcements, please consider joining my Patreon page. There are links in the description box. And now, let's begin our journey to the past. A good starting point when it comes to the fields of prehistoric archaeology and paleoanthropology, that is to say, the study of the behavior of prehistoric men and how their societies worked. So a good starting point is to take a look at the many discoveries and new hypotheses that happened in the past few decades. For something this ancient, it is impressive how the vision of our past as a species has evolved recently. I told you more about this in a past episode called The Journey to the Ice Age, in which I tried to summarize the state of science about the evolution of our genus, the genus Homo. In the classification of species, in taxonomy, a genus is a group of species that are closely apparented, and ours, the genus Homo, includes us, modern humans, plus extinct human species, like Homo habilis, Homo erectus, or Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. These extinct humans are also called archaic humans. So I was telling you the understanding of this past had changed a lot. 50 years ago, the general description of the history of the genus Homo was relatively simple, and it went like this. There would have been various species coming one after the other, maybe with a bit of overlap, but clearly reflecting an evolution towards more cognitive abilities and a more and more complex social life and capacity for abstraction. To simplify a little, first there would have been Homo habilis, a species using simple tools that lived in East and South Africa. Then Homo erectus, another species that appeared later and was notable for its use of fire and its migration out of Africa. And after that, Homo sapiens, modern humans, that would have also appeared in Africa before colonizing the entire planet. Neanderthal humans were also acknowledged as a late species of archaic humans that would have coexisted with Homo sapiens. This vision has been deeply questioned and no longer holds today because of multiple discoveries. Discoveries such as the existence of many other species or subspecies of archaic humans, that for some of them could have appeared in Eurasia rather than Africa. Also the realization that species of archaic humans overlapped way more than thought before. Their timelines indicate they would have coexisted for very long periods of times, hundreds of thousands of years. And yet another batch of discoveries led to the realization that maybe Homo sapiens did not represent such a gigantic leap in cognitive abilities. Because maybe some archaic humans, such as Neanderthals, could have had ways of artistic expression, an aesthetic, and a path of technical progress. All of this has led to paleontologists reconsidering the map and timeline of human species. It is paradoxical, but we now have more records, more information, but less certainties. And it is well possible that the understanding of our distant past will keep changing. I am telling you all this because this concept of behavioral modernity emerged progressively in the 20th century. In this context, when the timeline of humankind appeared relatively simple and orderly. By orderly, I mean it seemed to make a lot of sense, from humans with less cognitive abilities to humans with more, suggesting like a natural or spontaneous path towards more technical advancement, more culture, more planning, more complex societies. So it seemed a huge leap had happened, sometimes around 50,000 years ago, based mostly on archaeological sites located in Europe, where around that period, suddenly, cave art became more impressive, artifacts better made, many more ornaments, pigments for painting or body painting showed up, together with new tools. And this suggested a sudden change happening around 50,000 years ago, a kind of cultural revolution in the complexity of human behaviors. This is the concept of behavioral modernity. And so it was defined around a series of traits. We'll come back to these traits because there is a lot to say about them. But then, in the past few decades, the lines became blurred by the discovery of more evidence from other regions and other periods. What kind of discoveries? First, new sites dated from before 50,000 years ago, but also showing traces of behavioral modernity. Not as many, and not all of these same traits that had been included into the concept. But this now suggested that there was no sudden revolution, that it could have been more gradual, and instead of appearing more or less all at the same time, these criteria of modernity may well have popped up over a long period of time, and maybe traveled the world, being passed between human groups. An important discovery here was the discovery of a cave in 1991 in South Africa, Blombos Cave. It was dated from between 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, almost twice as ancient as these European sites that had served to define behavioral modernity, that had provided the benchmark. And excavations at this cave revealed shell beads used for ornamentation, as well as abstract engravings, and a kind of toolkit used to make paint with pigments. Objects that are all indicative of symbolic behavior, a big component of behavioral modernity. So this doesn't cover the whole range of traits associated with behavioral modernity, but it means that at least this aspect of it was present long before previously thought. And it questioned this idea that modernity was a kind of package of behaviors that would have necessarily come together due to a leap in human capabilities. It had been initially supposed that behavioral modernity could be the product of genetic mutations or neurological changes that would have demultiplied the possibilities of the human mind. But this kind of findings suggests something much more gradual, an accumulation over tens of thousands of years, starting maybe more than 100,000 years ago. This gradual model is now preferred by a majority of paleontologists. But this is not a certainty, and an objection is that Homo sapiens appeared around 300,000 years ago. But even the most ancient evidence of behavioral modernity that we have in our possession appeared almost 200,000 years after. So why such a delay if the species had these capabilities already? Why the absence of notable changes in culture, technology and behaviors for almost 200,000 years, followed by a takeoff? With the existence of such a takeoff, it could make more sense to hypothesize a kind of change, a mutation, a change in the brain, to explain an evolution that may not be sudden, but still appeared over a relatively short period of time, of a few tens of thousands of years at most. There is no definitive answer to this, but partisans of the gradual model also point to the possibility of disappearance of the records. We haven't found unambiguous signs of behavioral modernity from before 100,000 years ago. But it doesn't mean they never existed. And there is also the possibility of fade-outs. There were not that many humans 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. And a lot of traits that could have appeared could also have been lost. Groups were small and probably lived far apart on Earth. It is very uncertain and hard to assess, but just to give you an order of magnitude about the world's population at the time, the rare studies that tried to assess the population of Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago point to 100,000 to 300,000 in the entire world. They would have been in Africa at the time, but this is still not very dense. And 70,000 years ago, it has been observed that the world's population dropped dramatically. It is believed due to a gigantic volcanic eruption, the Toba catastrophe. The global population of Homo sapiens at this period could have dropped to as low as around 1,000 to 10,000 individuals in the entire world. So, with small groups, far apart, and at least one massive drop in population, maybe there were other lesser drops that went undetected. It is well possible that behavioral modernity appeared and disappeared with some of these groups, because it was not transmitted. Another element is the conservation of artifacts. Many have been found in caves where prehistoric men found shelter, especially under colder and wetter climates. In these caves, the archaeological records could have been better preserved. When they were sealed and forgotten, they became like time capsules. Whereas in warmer regions, Homo sapiens may have lived more outside, and their production of tools and artwork would have been less well preserved. Yet another thing that muddies the water is the discovery that other species of archaic humans, also had traits that could be classified as part of behavioral modernity. For example, Neanderthal engravings or collections of objects like shells, probably for their aspect, their aesthetic, were discovered and dated from before their contacts with Homo sapiens. And to make things even more complicated, different cases of Homo sapiens that looked quite advanced in some fields, but not at all in others, have also been found. For example, among the earliest known inhabitants of Australia, they seemed good at advanced planning because they traveled by sea on a relatively long distance. Yet their technology for many tools was still very simple and would not place them among culturally modern humans. So if behavioral modernity was not strictly limited to Homo sapiens and was not a package of traits, maybe its origin is not to be found in our species specifically, but maybe in other factors, external factors like the environment or demography. What if a rise in density, for example, with bigger groups of humans, be they archaic or modern, and more contacts between groups, was the triggering factor of this evolution? All of these are valid hypotheses, and as you see, all these discoveries of the past few decades raise more questions, like for the timeline of our genus, the cultural, social, psychological evolution of our species, since it appeared, is full of open questions and hypotheses with few certainties. This being said, behavioral modernity is still a valid concept, it may be hard to define precisely, hard to map and time, hard to determine whether it was such a revolution or a more gradual process, but it exists. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had a real but very slow technical progress. And they transmitted rather well their knowledge between generations, but without progressing much. They conserved technology and passed their know-how without changing it. They were technologically conservative. At an uncertain date, maybe around 100,000 years ago, maybe after, Homo sapiens transitioned to a phase of creativity and accumulation of knowledge that is markedly faster. The beginning of a curve that seems to only have accelerated since then. Maybe in between these two modes, technologic conservatism and behavioral modernity, there was a phase of unstable innovations for thousands of years, with breakthroughs and setbacks, partial adoptions of behavioral modernity. But after 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens are clearly doing things and living differently. They have embraced this new way of existing. So we are going to ask ourselves what in humanity or its environment could have triggered this transition. But before, what is the archaeological evidence that defines behavioral modernity? Bearing in mind that paleontologists still debate many of them. We're going to review the main ones and their history. The first one is the practice of burial of the dead. Interestingly, it is one of these traits that don't seem to have appeared with Homo sapiens. The earliest traces of intentional burial we know of are from the Neanderthals. To locate things on the timeline, the Neanderthals had appeared as a species around 400,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens, and they went extinct around 40,000 years ago. But not before having interbred with Homo sapiens. And many of us carry genes inherited from the Neanderthals, as the sequencing of DNA revealed. Not all of mankind, by the way. The percentage of Neanderthal DNA in us varies from close to 0 to around 3% of our DNA. The highest percentages, up to 3%, are found in and around Oceania. The Melanesians, Papuans, Aboriginal Australians. East Asians also have relatively high percentages, the Han Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans. Europeans and Western Eurasians have a bit less, 1 to 2%. South Asians, Indians, for a large part, around 1%. And the region of the world with the least Neanderthal DNA is Sub-Saharan Africa, where people are almost 100% Homo sapiens. Still, the percentages are low, and these differences come from the regions where the Neanderthals lived. They appeared out of Africa, in Europe and Western Asia. So this is where they mixed with Homo sapiens 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, after which ongoing migrations continued to spread their residual DNA. So the Neanderthals appeared before Homo sapiens, and they, or at least some of them, buried their dead in shallow graves. And they didn't just put bodies in a ditch, the graves were furnished with stone tools and animal bones. So this suggests something ritualistic in the practice. We ignore the meaning of these burials to them. It has been suggested that the practice of burial could be the earliest known form of religious practice in humanity, because concern for the dead may indicate a belief in a form of life after death. But the truth is that it is highly speculative, and there is always the risk of being anachronistic and attributing them our own way of looking at it, of forcing a meaning because we are familiar with it. As far as we know, burial did not appear immediately with the Neanderthals. The earliest sites with human burials have been dated to 100,000 years ago. That's interesting because it also suggests an evolution, a transition achieved by the Neanderthals. Their earliest known burial happened 300,000 years after their emergence, and also at a time when Homo sapiens was already there. Homo sapiens appeared in Africa and spread from there to the rest of the world. But the exact timeline of this migration is also debated. The consensus today is that the main exit from Africa by Homo sapiens, called the main out of Africa event, happened between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, a time when the Neanderthals lived in Eurasia, and this is when this interbreeding between the two species would have happened. But before that, various dispersals of Homo sapiens out of Africa were also detected. Less relevant because the groups either died out after a few thousand years or contributed almost nothing to living people today. And these earlier excursions began a few tens of thousands of years before the main event. Returning to burials, we ignore the motivations behind them. They may include getting rid of decomposing bodies, but that would not explain the presence of objects or the care put in these graves. It could also have been done not for the dead themselves, but for the living, as a way to bring closure to individuals emotionally affected by a death. That is a possibility. And the reason why we cannot fully state that there was a belief in an afterlife or a religious meaning associated with these first burials. Still, what sounds reasonable, plausible, is that burial is an expression of respect for the dead. And this is telling about human psychology. Not completely unique to humans, though. There are rare examples of animals that bury, or more precisely cover, their dead. Elephants do it. They often partially cover the bodies of their dead from their group with soil or branches. It is less systematic and more ambiguous, but some corvids, birds like crows, have also been observed covering their dead. And more animal species, mammals in particular, do not bury, but they express grief. Chimpanzees, gorillas, dolphins. Mothers may continue to carry their dead babies for weeks, refusing to let them go. Still, systematic burial or a ritual associated with the bodies of the dead, like cremation or transportation to a particular place after death. This is a very human behavior that transcends cultures. It may be an expression of religious beliefs, an attempt to find closure, also may be something that has to do with the functioning of society. Burials are public rituals generally. They are not just a way of showing respect to the dead. They are also a visible ritual, a way to demonstrate that the group respects its members. So it could also be a bonding mechanism between the living. Another archaeological evidence of behavioral modernity is figurative art. And that is a big one, a big criteria that led to the invention of the concept of behavioral modernity. Because its existence, the existence of figurative art, suggests a group, a cluster of cognitive abilities. Why is that? First, because when you create a figurate image, be it a painting on a cave wall or a figurine, you need to mentally hold an internal representation of something and translate this representation into an object or a picture that others can recognize. It means you create a symbol, a representation of something that is not the exact same thing, but evokes it. That can be seen as the birth of art, the creation of a symbol that is the interpretation by the human mind of something real. Only humans create figurative art. It may be decorative, but it is a step beyond mere ornamentation or random markings. It reveals the existence of a mind that produces and transfers symbols. And this is the definition of symbolic thinking. The earliest traces of non-figurative art, consisting of simple geometric shapes or hand stencils, you know, these prints of hands on cave walls, either positive after putting pigments on the inside of the hand and pressing it on a wall, or negative, made by blowing pigments on the hand applied to a wall. So these examples of non-figurative art could be as old as 64,000 years ago. But figurative art appeared later, beginning around 45,000 years ago, on various sites located in Europe and Southeast Asia. But that is not all. Figurative art also tells us of an understanding of the mind of others. It is made to be recognizable. So the artist must anticipate how the viewer will see it. The viewer has to understand that this flat image on a wall, or this clump of ivory, is a horse or a mammoth or an ox. Doing that requires an understanding that others have minds, minds that can interpret symbols the same way I do. And this is a cornerstone of human social cognition. We can relate to each other, understand each other when we express points of views, when we share information, when we create art, because we acknowledge our similarity. It sounds basic because we do it all the time, but it had to appear. And that is something very human too. Yet another connection between figurative art and the development of the mind is that our ability to represent something that is not here demonstrates the capacity to think about things that are removed in time and space. It is a recreation based on stored memories. The same cognitive ability that is required for complex language. When we speak, we use words and structures stored in our minds, in our memories, to communicate. Or for planning, when we plan ahead, we use memories of things and the causal chains between them to project ourselves into the future. It also serves for storytelling. We use again our stock of memories, our language, and our imagination to create the object that is a story. Here again, things that seem so natural to us that we don't think much about them, but that potential for abstraction is another characteristic that only humans have developed. And to that extent, not that long ago, taking figurative art as evidence, it was at most 50,000 years ago. And finally, a last aspect of figurative art that proves behavioral modernity is the existence of conventions in artwork. From the beginning, figurative art adopted and followed conventions, specific ways of depicting eyes, horns, body proportions. Conventions that could be different between different parts of the world, but that were widely shared across the same regions and across generations. These conventions tell us of the existence of teaching, of traditions, of cultural transmission. So in summary, cave art or small prehistoric statues are way more than pretty objects or pretty pictures. They are an open window into the minds and social organization of prehistoric men. That tells us that they had modern imagination, symbolic thought, a theory of mind, that is to say, an acknowledgement that other humans had minds too, and an understanding of how they worked. Cultural transmission and the ability to create shared meaning through material culture. The existence of traditions. These are huge things. And as far as we know, only Homo sapiens achieved that. Our species did it on every continent, under all habitable climates, in a period of time that starts from 45,000 years ago. What are other signs of behavioral modernity? A good one, too, is the transport of resources over long distances, long-distance trade. We know resources could be transported far, thanks to their discovery on archaeological sites where they could not have arrived otherwise. The earliest signs of such transportation were found in Africa. And this is one of these criteria of behavioral modernity that seems to have appeared long before it was initially thought. You remember Blombos Cave in South Africa that I told you about before, because evidence of modernity had been found there earlier than thought possible. So at Blombos Cave, ochre pieces, ochre is a pigment, generally reddish-brown or yellow, and also marine shells have been found. The site is inland, and these pieces had to be transported over tens of miles or kilometers. Even older than that, in Kenya, obsidian used for making tools. Obsidian is very hard, so it gave good blades. So obsidian was discovered that had been sourced at least 25 kilometers away, possibly more. And this was very old. around 300,000 years ago, at the very beginnings of Homo sapiens. Later in Europe, between 45,000 and 20,000 years ago, numerous examples of transportation of shells, stones for tools, or pigments, even amber from the Baltic region, have been found, with long distances of several hundred miles sometimes. So, why is long-distance transportation relevant here? Because it takes advanced cognitive and social abilities, planning and foresight to launch expeditions, often in challenging environments. It requires food, water, orientation. Then, if there is trade involved, something to offer in exchange for the products you want. All of this takes networks, trust, cooperation, including between different groups which extend beyond immediate kin relationships. When goods are traded that are not purely utilitarian, like pigments or ornaments, this also reflects abstract thinking. The value of goods becomes based on their symbolic value or their aesthetic value. So this long-distance trade is a revelator and also a factor of success for Homo sapiens. Cultural exchange through trade, contacts with other groups, it is something that favors the spread of innovation. You see a type of object or a technique. Now that you are a Homo sapiens with behavioral modernity, you have the mind to memorize it, to process it, to reproduce it later, maybe a bit differently if necessary. And that gives technological progress a boost. It also helps the species to live better or survive in some regions, despite the scarcity of resources, allowing for larger and more resilient populations. So here again, long-distance transportation is a good indicator that humanity was on a path of progress, of modernity. A third archaeological indicator of behavioral modernity is the study of blade tools, especially these thin, standardized stone blades that appear in the Upper Paleolithic, the period that corresponds to the emergence of behavioral modernity. Why is that? Stone blades were nothing new. They had been in use by Homo habilis and Homo erectus for hundreds of thousands of years. But they began to improve dramatically, with the first signs of improvement appearing in Africa between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, and spreading on the continent and then the rest of the world. These much better blades were found in multiple places in Africa, dated to 75 to 60,000 years ago, and in Eurasia between 50 to 40,000 years before our time. So again, why are new stone blades evidence of something? Because older ones, produced by Homo erectus, were often made rather randomly by breaking stones and hoping that some of the fragments would serve. There was intentionality in this, several hits to shape them, but blades were not standardized at all, and this changes in the behavioral modernity era. They become way more intentional, especially long and thin blades that can be used as spearheads, arrowheads, or as knives. And these require regular and symmetrical blades with two edges. In order to make them, the approach changes. It is no longer about fracturing stones and hoping for the best. The maker has a model in mind and needs to shape the blade with hundreds or even thousands of hits. This requires precise control of force, knowledge of the material. It is more like sculpture instead of intuitive trial and error. In order to envision and make an object far removed from the original nodule of stone. An object that obeys to conventions, a standard. So here again, like for figurative art, we have several cognitive steps necessary before this can be achieved. And even more so because tools and weapons become composite. These blades will now be hafted to create spears, arrows, knives or picks. And again, hafting requires abstract thinking, planning, and the ability to integrate multiple raw materials, stone, wood, resin, some kind of natural fiber to keep the tool or the weapon together. Blades are utilitarian, but it seems they also had variations in styles. In the same regions and the same periods, using the same materials, different groups produced blades of different sizes and aspect, as if they also became vehicles for group identity. They carried a specific way of doing things, transmitted and perfected generation after generation. The example of stone tools and blades also extends to bone tools, tools made out of long bones, antlers, or ivory. Stones are good to make relatively large tools, but for things like needles or harpoons, a good material was bone. Stone is too hard to shape into small objects, and wood is too soft. Here again, the making of bone tools required advanced planning, prolonged scraping, grinding, and polishing with abrasives. That is to say, the use of existing tools to produce other tools. Bones would also be soaked before working them, and then treated with fire to harden them. This level of planning and technical investment was very rare before 100 to 70,000 years ago, and it appears in multiple locations after that, with even more sophistication. The first eyed needles show up in South Africa around 65,000 years ago. They tell us of the sophistication required to make them, but not only. Their existence indicates that clothes were now sewed, tailored, with animal skins and furs at this point. We are before the invention of weaving. But there again, it illustrates the existence of an industry with multiple steps, delayed return, and the existence of tailored clothing fitted to a person. This suggests that clothes are no longer only a protection against the cold. They become also a way of social display. Another example of growing sophistication is the evolution of these bone tools to make them more efficient. Harpoons became barbed to retain prey, and fishing hooks also show up. The type of fishing made possible by hooks is also considered a sign of behavioral modernity for all the previous steps it implies. We could also mention other archaeological evidence of the transition to behavioral modernity, like body ornamentation, body painting, jewelry. But the last one I'm going to elaborate on is the appearance of music instruments. It is hard to tell when the production of music began, because sounds could have been produced without leaving traces, for example using shells as rattles, bones or pieces of wood for percussion, or by drumming on logs, hollow logs, or stalactites to make sounds. All of this may have existed, but we have no way of knowing it. The first objects that were undoubtedly music instruments show up 40 to 45,000 years ago, maybe a few thousand years earlier, but the records found are more ambiguous before that. In any case, this also happened around this 50 to 40,000 years mark, when all signs, all criteria of behavioral modernity appear to be in place. The oldest uncontested musical instruments in the world discovered to date are bone flutes from the south of Germany, and they are surprisingly complex. One is a long flute of about 1 foot 35 centimeters, made from the radius bone of a vulture. Bird bones were perfect to make flutes because they are hollow, but it is not that easy to find a long bird bone. This flute has 5 finger holes that were precisely drilled, and on one end it is notched. It is still playable today, and it can produce 5 different musical notes. Another flute of ivory, of mammoth ivory, was also found, but broken. It was reconstructed from its fragments, and it shows similar precision as the first one. Other objects that could have been flutes have been found, but they are less convincing. One in Slovenia, for example, that was initially thought to be a flute because it is the bone of a bear with holes. But it is suspected that these holes are actually damage caused by the teeth of another carnivore animal, not man-made. Another type of instruments is rattles. A set of perforated toe bones of reindeer or fox was found, and dated to 40,000 years ago. It is obviously intentional, but its use is less obvious. It could have been used as an instrument by shaking it, but it could also have been an ornament, a part of a costume. So with all these examples in mind, it leaves little doubt that a transition took place that completely changed the way humankind perceived existence, socialized, lived, even died, as we saw with burial rituals. It is uncertain how this transition took place, whether it came as a package of traits that were interconnected, or a more gradual process of accumulation with breakthroughs and setbacks. These are open debates that may be reframed by future discoveries. But that leaves us with one last big question. Why? Why the emergence of symbolic thinking, of complex tool-making, cumulative culture that builds on previous knowledge much more and much faster than before? The emergence, too, of expanded social networks and cooperation between groups of humans, as shown by the transportation of resources. There are various possible explanations, and as often it could be a combination of several of them. Maybe this is the point, a conjunction of factors that existed together at the same time and triggered this revolution. What could be the triggers? Let's take a look at the various hypotheses. First, it could come from within Homo sapiens. It could be a neurological change or a genetic mutation that would have made brains better at conceptualizing, planning, communicating. In other words, expanded cognitive abilities. This could make sense because it has been observed that between 100,000 and 35,000 years ago, human brains changed. They did not grow in size overall, but they became rounder, experts say more globular. And some of the areas of the brain expanded, especially the ones that deal with planning ahead, symbolic thinking, and understanding of what others are feeling, what we could call empathy. How do we know that when prehistoric brains have disappeared long ago? Because the skulls show it. The inner surface of the skull, the endocast, records the outer shape of the brain, and so this shape can be recreated long after. Sometimes, in rare cases, because sediment filled the brain cavity after death and hardened, providing a natural cast of the brain. More often, by making a recreation, either digital or physical, of the space occupied by the brain and its shape. So we know rather well how prehistoric brains were shaped overall, and the evolution towards more globularity and the increase in size of these areas I mentioned has been confirmed. The way the brain works is not only about the size. The wiring is also very important. Like a computer or a smartphone does not only depend on the hardware, its software is also crucial. Our brains did not suddenly grow, but they got reorganized. And the combination of this tweaked architecture and increased potential in areas dealing with symbolic thinking could have removed limiting factors for the expansion of cognitive abilities. Homo sapiens were all anatomically modern. A Homo sapiens from 200,000 years ago, shaved and in modern clothes, would be undetectable visually. But maybe his cognitive abilities would have been markedly different from his successors from 50,000 years ago, or today. In other words, the trigger could have been minor changes to the hardware and the software of our brains, reorganized neural pathways with huge effects on cognition. This change could have come or have been triggered by small genetic changes. The study of prehistoric DNA also reveals that several genes went through tiny changes in this period, or new genes appeared, including one called FOXP2, a gene that is key for speech, and a gene that, interestingly, Neanderthals also carried. The Neanderthals that showed some signs of behavioral modernity, not all of them. This gene is thought to be necessary to speak in long and complicated sentences with grammar, the kind of talking we do today. So these evolutions of brains possibly, even probably, played a role. But as we saw before, signs of behavioral modernity showed up before these modern brains completely formed, and also in archaic humans. At least this is what the current state of knowledge of the archaeological records indicates. So it looks likely that other factors were at play too, factors of a more external nature, rather than biological. One of them could be the demography. I briefly mentioned it before, but this could be an explanation for why innovations and modern thinking manage to accelerate and last. A larger population size, with more groups that are bigger, means first that retention of knowledge can increase. When groups are very small, a handful of individuals, what they know can easily disappear. These groups may fade out without descendants, and even if they last, they present a high risk of setbacks if they lose the few individuals that carry a certain know-how. When groups are larger, transmission of traditions and techniques is more stable. Individuals may also become more specialized. And when there are more groups and they start exchanging, cooperating, trading, this fosters innovation and the spread of discoveries. This network effect in Africa and Eurasia could have become a big positive for the cultural and technical evolution of Homo sapiens after 60,000 years ago, as the world's population recovered, presumably from the Toba catastrophe. A small population could also explain why the evolution of Neanderthals towards higher cognitive abilities was patchy. Actually, more groups can also have an impact on genetic diversity and favor the appearance of these new genes that would have triggered higher cognitive abilities. It is hard to research, but it is believed that groups could have exchanged members, and this would have helped reduce the risk of inbreeding and helped maintain a healthier pool of genes. Another possible external trigger could be environmental, climatic. Between 75 and 60,000 years ago, the geologic records indicate severe droughts and colder periods. This would have meant harsher conditions, scarcity of resources, which at first sight is not favorable, but provided it was not severe enough to kill everyone, that can be a strong incentive to become more efficient, search for better techniques and tools to hunt, better planning too, with all the externalities this could have had on communication skills, socialization. Homo sapiens could have been pressured to become more adaptable, to travel longer distances to become more efficient. More efficient hunting also means the risk of depopulating a given area of its prey. More migrations could also have led to the development of seafaring techniques, for example. The idea is that a moderate deterioration in the environment could also have favored the development of many new skills. Yet another factor is not really an initial trigger, but it could have been an accelerator: the appearance of symbolic language. Communication with the voice, certainly existed before, but complex language with abstractions, a large vocabulary, a grammar, this is on another level, and it also emerged with behavioral modernity. It is thought to have been present, at least in some groups of Homo sapiens, by 75,000 years ago. And this changes everything. It opens way more possibility of transmission, teaching, social learning, social bonding too. Complex language is one of several changes that favored a virtuous circle. Technologies can do it too. Better weapons, better shelters. This means improved survival, so more population, and so more opportunities for invention and transmission, more specialization. This creates loops, self-reinforcing loops. Now, all these factors may well work together. The wiring of our brains, these neural pathways that I mentioned before, are not entirely determined by biology. They form as young individuals grow up and receive all their learning from the group they belong to. This, combined with a genetic or biological potential, is what forms the mind, the personality, the behaviors. And so all or some of these factors may have been finally assembled like a puzzle, sometime between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, unlocking the potential that changed humanity forever, setting the stage for mankind to colonize the earth and develop the first civilizations a few thousand years ago. As always, there would be much more to say about this fascinating topic, but I hope this little talk gave you an overview. This is the end of our story for tonight. If you are not sleepy yet, there are many other episodes, many other stories that wait for you in my library. Or you may keep your eyes shut, let go, and fall asleep. I'll be back soon with a new episode. And in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.